When we look into the past, we can see that in history, hundreds of years ago or yesterday, there are some things that are universal in this world. Creativity, community, culture, speech, and curiosity. This more than anything else. Humans inherently always make efforts to learn more about the world. Humans explore. We go places we don't necessarily have to go. We seek answers to questions about existence. After World War II, a world existed that was prepared to commit mutually assured destruction. War technology was at its peak, and politicians, one might argue, had to make excuses for this mass proliferation. Not only did peace eventually come from those decisions, but a new appreciation for our existence was discovered over the next several decades. We have to start at a time that can best be described as misunderstood. Imagine the years following the Great Patriotic War. Much like there is talk today over the proliferation of nuclear weapons, following the war, there was what would best be described as a missile race. Some of this research can be very overwhelming. Government programs like Operation Paperclip, in which over 1,600 Nazi scientists were hired by the American government to work for NASA, can boggle the mind even today. Indeed, this is a reminder that we are addressing a time in government when secret covert programs were king and transparency lacked greatly. Who was behind many of these programs? Well, I'd like you to meet President Harry S. Truman. Much like Ulysses S. Grant, his parents couldn't decide on a middle name, so they just gave him an S. As a child, he would serve as a Shabbos Goy for Jewish neighbors, which means he did tasks for them on Shabbat that their religion prevented them from doing. His mother was 13 when the Civil War ended. He barely attended college and dealt with bouts of homelessness. He worked as a clerk at a bank and struggled to earn a law degree. He also had been involved in 3 failed businesses. Truman is the only president since William McKinley to not earn a college degree. Later, he'd spend much of his young adult years in the National Guard, and then on the Western Front in the First World War. During the war, he became a first lieutenant, and once provided support for George S. Patton's tank brigade at the start of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He was reported to have fired some of the last shots of the war. Following the war, he had a 5-year-long judicial career. Then, he became the president of a national highway, and by 1933, Truman was named Missouri's director for the Federal Reemployment Program, which was part of the Civil Works Administration under Franklin D. Roosevelt. This decision would change history for the next 80-some-odd years. Following his next 10 years as a show-me state senator, he became involved in the Democratic Party's leadership. This is sort of complicated, so let's go over it. At the 1944 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt did not attend because his health was failing. And for that reason, his vice presidential selection was ever more important to everyone in attendance. Henry Wallace, the then most famous anti-war politician in America, and the current VP, was on FDR's mind. But he had lots of enemies. Most notably, in his May of 1942 speech, called the Common Man's Speech, he essentially called for a people's revolution. His speech was received very poorly on Capitol Hill. Winston Churchill even suggested that Wallace should be spied on, as Wallace spoke very frankly about detesting the British Empire, and specifically, he called out Churchill's racism. He was seen by many to be the right successor to Roosevelt. However, partially because of the massive supermajority the Democrats had in the 1930s, the party was huge. Everyone wanted a slice of the power. It should also be noted that this was a time of institutional corruption in Washington. FDR was told by powerful leadership in the Democratic Party that an effort to renominate Wallace for vice president would split the party apart. On the opening day of the convention, a Gallup poll showed that 65% of Democrats supported Wallace for vice president, while only 2% supported Truman. Apparently, someone stole the loudspeaker microphone and played Wallace's campaign song on the convention floor. The legacy of this convention today is filled with charges of corruption and dirty politics. A highly concerted effort took place behind closed doors to nominate Truman for vice president. While the events during the convention have largely been lost to history, they irreparably changed the future. Just 9 months later, and 2 months before the Normandy landings, on April 12, 1945 at noon, while Elizabeth Shomatoff was painting this portrait of Franklin Roosevelt, he suddenly said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." He then slumped forward in his chair, went unconscious, and died about 3 hours later of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Shortly after, Truman was rushed to the White House, where he first approached Eleanor Roosevelt, who told him that the president was dead. Truman then asked Mrs. Roosevelt, "Is there anything I can do for you?" She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Not only would Harry Truman have to lead the United States out of the Second World War, but he'd also inherit a country tempered by war. Soon, the Allied powers would beat back the Nazis, begin denazification, and the United States would drop 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While today there is a lot of debate about these bombings, most often forget that there was a lot of debate within the U.S. government on the military necessity of the strikes. Most notably, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, Brigadier General Carter Clark, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Fleet Admiral William Halsey Jr., and Major General Curtis LeMay all opposed the bombings. These bombings killed between around 120,000 to 200,000 people, as well as 1 British, 7 Dutch, and 12 American prisoners of war. It is hard to say today whether these atomic bombings were the right decision. It was a tough choice that we all imagine never wanting to make. War is not just, and it will never be just. The more we try to justify war, the more we will be numb to it. On September 2nd, 1945, Imperial Japan surrendered. Now it is time to share Soviet perspective up until this point. Between the 1910s and the 1940s, the place known today as Mother Russia was a region controlled by one man. He was born in 1878 as Yosef Vissarionovich Jejugashvili. Soon, he'd go by a different name. Some would call him the People's Commissioner and the General Secretary, but he went by Joseph Stalin. He loved playing pool, watching movies, and reading. He also created a personality cult, which led to his purges, which ended with the deaths of around 20 million people, whether that be 6 million Ukrainians who were starved to death, or the NKVD prisoner massacres, which killed 100,000 people. Stalin was ruthless. There is one story that might blow your mind. They say Stalin was giving a speech, and after the speech was over, everyone gave him a standing ovation. The people present were afraid to stop clapping, so the ovation kept going for several minutes, and the first person who stopped clapping was thrown in prison for years. Yet, the Western world had to work with Stalin during and after the Second World War. It's hard to form an opinion on the Soviets' involvement today in World War II, because while their massive victory over the Nazis often gets overlooked, it's hard to be proud about the triumph, knowing how savagely brutal both Stalin and his puppets were. After the war, Stalin was at the height of his reign. On April 25, 1945, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River near Torgau in Germany, which is the most recent time both nations' armies had a friendly encounter as allies. It is often very difficult to process just exactly what Stalin meant to his people. Was he God? Was he a supreme leader? Was he something in the middle? These feelings can be best described by comparing both Russians crying and North Koreans crying after their leaders, Stalin, and Kim Jong-il died. Clearly, their people saw them as gods. And God can't die, right? A few years following the war in 1949, while the U.S. installed the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, Stalin came up with his own plan of creating what is today known as the Eastern Bloc. This created the Iron Curtain, which essentially separated Europe into free and oppressed countries. The Soviet military was so massive at this point that frankly, no one could stop them, especially these small European countries that had been destroyed during World War II. Freedom wasn't an option for a lot of people that lived in these regions. When we talk about history, it can be easy to get caught up with the discussion of freedom in America. But it is important to acknowledge that freedom and the right to exist wasn't something that Eastern Europeans had during and following the Second World War. It is easy to talk about what is and what isn't freedom, but until you experience it, there is no honest way to describe it. Also in 1949, while the United States believed they were the only country to have nuclear weapons, something happened that would terrify the world. On August 29, 1949, about 72 years ago, the Soviet Union conducted its first nuclear test.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion sends reporters racing for Flushing Meadow, where Russia's Vyshinsky arrives to address the United Nations.
Mr. Vyshinsky, have you got any statement about President Truman's statement on the atomic bomb?
Please, excuse me.
Does Russia have the atomic bomb?
Yes.
Well, won't you reply to me?
The Russian foreign minister maintains his silence about Russia's atomic progress in his address. He accuses the West of planning atomic war and urges the outlawing of atomic weapons. But he makes no reference to Russian agreement on international inspection, keystone to control. Secretary of State Acheson says of America's stand,
In connection with the President's statement that there has been an atomic explosion in the Soviet Union, I wish to emphasize that from the very beginning of the development of atomic energy, this nation has been determined to do everything in its power to proceed toward a truly effective international system of control. It would be deluding ourselves to get something on paper that was not really effective. The President's statement underlines the importance of having an effective method of control.
Codenamed RDS-1 at the Semipalatinsk test site in modern-day Kazakhstan. The device had a yield of 22 kilotons. Why did they do this? Well, much like today, where China is competing with the United States to be the one and only superpower. During the early stages of the Cold War, the Soviet Union wanted to be a superpower. Just 2 months after the Soviets' first nuclear test, Chairman Mao Zedong took power in China following the Chinese Civil War. Stalin did not think Mao and his communists could win their civil war. Yet, following the war, Marxists, communists, and socialists, call them what you will, controlled a third of the world's landmass. While Stalin initially refused to have a relationship with China out of fear that they'd need money and military might in case of another civil war, eventually he warmed to the idea, considering the landmass. This ended up helping the Soviets greatly, as once the Korean War started, on June 25, 1950, following when North Korean communists crossed the 38th parallel behind artillery fire, the Soviets were able to convince the Chinese to support the North Koreans, rather than doing it themselves. It should also be noted that the Soviet Union was one of the first nations to give the new state of Israel diplomatic recognition in 1948. In another story that speaks to the personality of Stalin, when the Israeli ambassador Golda Meir arrived in Moscow, Stalin quickly became furious at the sight of Jewish crowds who gathered to greet her Soon after, he would have a falling out with Israel, which coincided with the launching of an anti-Semitic campaign within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. In the last years of Stalin's life, he was quite ill. He took very long holidays, and he didn't trust doctors. The fact is that Stalin imprisoned massive amounts of doctors in the Soviet Union during his reign. Right around this time in 1952 and 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower had been elected as the U.S. president. America was in a baby boom. Changes in political leadership on both sides started to shift the dynamic of the Cold War. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin's staff found him barely conscious on his bedroom floor. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, much like Roosevelt. He was moved onto a couch and remained there for 3 days. He was hand-fed using a spoon, and leeches were applied to him. Stalin died on March 3rd, 1953. Some believe today that he may have been murdered. Crowds were so massive at his 3-day memorial service that around 100 people were killed in stampedes. Very quickly, there was a confusing rotation of new Soviet leaders until Stalin was eventually replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. A few years later, on February 25, 1956, Khrushchev shocked delegates to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party by reading out loud and denouncing Stalin's crimes. He called for the implementation of a government program that essentially amounted to what we know today as de-Stalinization. He said in the speech that the only way to reform and move away from Stalin's legacy would be to acknowledge the horrors of the past. When he said that, there were audible gasps in the room. While Khrushchev gives the impression here of being a good leader, he kind of had a thing for threatening the West with nuclear war. From 1956 through 1961, he made many such statements, most notably on November 18, 1956, while addressing Western diplomats at a dinner in Moscow's Polish embassy. Khrushchev said, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." Once again, there were audible gasps in the room. Later on, he also often spoke of provoking wars, of national liberation, rather than nuclear wars. At this point, both the Soviet Union and the United States had thousands of nuclear devices. This was a time of immense buildup, and the Soviets now wanted to flex to the world. So, on October 4th, 1957, at 10:28 p.m. Moscow time, Sputnik 1 was launched into a low Earth orbit as part of the newly founded Soviet space program. To put it mildly, once more, this Soviet action terrified the United States. The U.S. tried to respond to Sputnik on December 6, 1957, with the launch of the Vanguard test. But that failed. While the booster did ignite and rise, about 2 seconds after liftoff, after rising about 4 feet, the rocket lost thrust and fell back to the launch pad. As it fell, the fuel tanks exploded, destroying the rocket and severely damaging the launch pad of Cape Canaveral. This was an embarrassment. Eisenhower then asked Congress to create a civilian agency to be established to be in charge of space activities. This bill was led by the then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, who helped create the National Aeronautics and Space Act. And by July 29, 1958, what we know today as NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was created by the stroke of President Dwight D. Eisenhower's pen. Let's talk about Ike. Born in 1890 in Texas, he was the child of a Jehovah's Witness. He graduated West Point in 1915, but was denied a request to serve in Europe, and instead commanded a unit that trained tank crews. He would later go to serve under various generals, and was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General in 1941. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower was assigned to the General Staff in Washington. He went from that position to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And then, in December of 1943, President Roosevelt decided that Eisenhower would be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Today, I think he's described best as an anti-war general. Few give Eisenhower's legacy the respect it deserves, especially in hindsight, when looking at his adamant stance on the prevention of war.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is, I repeat, the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense.
By 1959, both nations had sent multiple rovers and rockets to the moon. Not to mention, both nations had sent animals to space. And by the U.S. presidential election of 1960, the space race and the Cold War was on everyone's minds. Just 11 days after the inauguration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the Americans sent a chimpanzee named Ham on a suborbital flight on the Mercury capsule and recovered him safely on January 31st, 1961, the same day he launched. There was huge amounts of excitement for the newly elected president. But, despite all of his gorgeous rhetoric, Kennedy's first few months in office were a disaster. First, he approved a CIA-sponsored invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs that ended in mishap after mishap. Then, he felt he'd been bullied by Khrushchev in their Vienna June of 1961 summit meeting. After that, he was unable to prevent the Soviets from building the Berlin Wall, and in Southeast Asia, he refused to intervene against a communist revolution in Laos. His political opponents labeled him as unprepared, immature, and unable to lead the Western world against what appeared to be mounting communist aggression. It was at this time that Soviet and American scientists had to ask themselves a question: can a human survive in space? Just a few animals had survived and were able to be brought back, so there was a lot of doubt among the populace that this wouldn't end in embarrassment and bloodshed. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets shocked the world by launching Yuri Gagarin into a single 108-minute orbit around the Earth in a craft called Vostok 1. What's interesting about the difference between early NASA missions and early Soviet space missions is that the Soviets re-entered on land, while the American re-entered on water. Now, NASA and the Americans had to answer. They created Project Mercury, whose main goal was to have an American orbit the Earth. It accompanied 7 astronauts, who were known as the Mercury 7. Each man would have one mission. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, launching in Mercury Redstone 3 in a spacecraft he named Freedom 7. Today, this fact is often unknown, but he did not orbit the Earth like Gagarin. The media called it his 15 minutes of fame, though he was the first person to exercise manual control over a spacecraft's altitude. and conduct retro rocket firing. After his successful return, Shepard was celebrated as a national hero, as were all American astronauts, just like the cosmonauts. Following Shepard's mission, Gus Grissom repeated Shepard's suborbital flight in Liberty Bell 7 on July 21, 1961. He nearly drowned during splashdown, but that will be explained later. Then, almost a full year after the Soviet Union put a person into orbit, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962. His Mercury Atlas 6 mission completed 3 orbits in his Friendship 7 spacecraft and splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean. The United States then launched more Mercury flights, Sigma 7 on October 3, 1962 with 6 orbits, and Faith 7 on May 15, 1963 of 22 orbits. NASA then decided to concentrate on developing Project Gemini, which intended to have 2 astronauts in a spacecraft rather than 1. About 1 month after Faith 7, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, was launched into space on Vostok 6 on June 16, 1963. While this was likely a propaganda stunt and possibly a medical experiment, the U.S. did not equal this accomplishment until the early 1980s with Sally Ride. Over the 3 previous years, John F. Kennedy made several speeches to urge support for not only the space program, but also pressed his aims for the moon.
And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. New ignorance, new problems, new dangers. Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. In short, our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men, and to become the world's leading spacefaring nation. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. And only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space any more than we go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Even before Project Gemini could begin, the United States was hit by tragedy. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. To this day, there are still questions about who exactly killed him and why. The American president was now Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was born in an unincorporated town of less than 500 people in Stonewall, Texas, during the last few months of the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. The space program and the fate of the Cold War were now in his hands.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the House, members of the Senate, my fellow Americans. All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
At this point, coup d'etats, wars, and genocides were raging in Vietnam, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, and Indonesia. While many today use the term Cold War to suggest violence was suspended, this is not true at all. Gemini took a year longer than planned to make its first flight, but the Soviets had their own version of Project Gemini, called Voskhod, and on October 12, 1964, Voskhod 1 became the first space flight with a 3-person crew. Then, on March 18, 1965, about a week before the first piloted Project Gemini spaceflight, the Soviets launched their two cosmonaut Voskod 2 mission with Pavel Belyayev and Alexei Leonov performed the first ever spacewalk as part of the mission. Just 10 weeks later, Ed White became the first American to go for a walk in space. Often, many remember from this mission how Ed White jokingly refused to get back into the spacecraft at the end of his spacewalk because he was having so much fun. By October 16, 1964, Leonid Brezhnev and a small group of high-ranking Communist Party officials overthrew Khrushchev as the Soviet government's leader one day after Voskod 1 landed in what was called the Wednesday Conspiracy. These new political leaders ended the Voskod program, canceling Voskod 3 and 4, which were in the planning stages, and started concentrating on reaching the moon. The Soviets then had a nearly 2-year stoppage of space activity, which gave the Americans a great opportunity to showcase Project Gemini. Gemini had 10 manned missions between March 1965 and November 1966. Gemini 3, 4, 5, 6A, 7, 8, 9A, 10, 11, and Gemini 12. Spacewalks were also expanded, so much so that on Gemini 12, Buzz Aldrin spent over 5 hours working outside the spacecraft during 3 sessions. Additionally, Gemini 5 had an 8-day orbit, while Gemini 7 had a 14-day flight. This helped show NASA that humans could survive in space for extended periods, such as a potential week-long trip to the moon. Though most notably, Gemini 8 experienced the first in-space mission abort on March 17, 1966, as just after achieving the world's first docking, the spacecraft went into an uncontrolled spin. Command pilot Neil Armstrong was able to stop the spinning by using the re-entry control system. He and his crewmate, David Scott, landed and were recovered successfully. Most of the crews on these early Gemini missions would later go on to command and be part of the Apollo missions. This was done so that spaceflight experience was elevated for the pool of astronauts for the lunar missions. With the ending of Gemini, the U.S. had exercised all the technology necessary to make Kennedy's goal of landing an American on the moon by the end of the decade a reality.
The Soviets also had intentions to go to the moon. They planned secret manned moon landings in 1967 and expected to have launches in 1968. While the space race was becoming more and more exciting for the world, few could grasp the moment, as this was a very dark time for the United States and Eastern Europe.
The Vietnam War, funded on both sides by the Americans and the Soviets, was raging on despite it becoming ever more unpopular, especially after the reporting of the My Lai massacre, in which U.S. Army soldiers raped and killed around 500 Vietnamese men, women, and children. Even infants were killed. Everything changed in Vietnam for the Americans when the company's photographer, Ronald Haverhill, had his photos released by the U.S. government during an investigation. These photos shocked everyone.
Also, in 1968, The invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union occurred, in which it is largely believed today that the invasion caused the worldwide communist movement to fall apart, ultimately leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The United States also dealt with more assassinations, as in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who had been running for president, were both killed by assassins in the span of just 2 months. The assassination of Dr. King caused many major riots in American cities, which is one of the reasons why many hold this next speech by Kennedy in their hearts to this day.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up to your own volition if it can be handled in this.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Now the United States was about to elect a new president. On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson appeared on national television to announce he would not be seeking re-election. This decision shocked a lot of people, but what surprised some people even more was the re-emergence of Richard Nixon.
Dick Nixon was the vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he was instrumental in discussions with the Soviets early on during the Cold War. Most notably, in 1959, he essentially debated Nikita Khrushchev on camera, impromptu, during the opening of the American National Exhibition at Sokolniki Park in Moscow on July 24th.
Что-то ты выйдешь очень сердитый, вроде ты хочешь подраться. Ты же не такой сердитый.
That's right.
Это когда-то он был кавалеристом тогда, а теперь он мирный человек.
Oh, yes. He still is. Какое у вас пока общее впечатление выставки?
Если говорить о впечатлении, сейчас видно, что строители не успели закончить строительные свои дела, и экспонаты еще, так сказать, не находятся. Вот возможности Америки, сколько она существует лет уже? 300? 300 лет? 150 лет независимости. Вот мы тогда скажем, что Америка 150 лет, значит, существует, вот ее уровень. Мы 42 года, еще не совершилось. Еще нам 7 лет, и мы будем на таком же уровне, как Америка. А в следующий пойдем дальше, вперед.
Резервы остается у нас.
А?
100 лет резервы остается.
Но мы, когда вас обгоним на разъезде, мы вам приветствие такое любезное скажем. Потом, если хотите, мы можем остановиться и сказать, пожалуйста, за нами, пожалуйста. Вопрос социального устройства, вы хотите при капитализме, живите. Это дело ваше, это вопрос внутренний, нас не касается. Мы можем вам сочувствовать, ну что же, раз вы не понимаете, ну живите так, как понимаете.
Mr. Vice President, from what you have seen of our exhibition, how do you think it is going to impress the people of the Soviet Union?
It's a very effective exhibit, and it's one that will cause a great deal of interest. I might say that this morning, I very early in the morning went down to visit a market, and where the farmers from various outskirts of the city bring in their items to sell. I can only say that there was a great deal of interest among these people who were workers and farmers, etc. I would imagine that the exhibition from that standpoint will therefore be a considerable success. As far as Mr. Khrushchev's comments just now, they are in the tradition we learned to expect from him of speaking extemporaneously and frankly whenever he has an opportunity. I can only say that if this competition which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit,
Мы в
you never
ракете вас
concede anything.
опередили, и в этой технике вас опередили. Американцы умные люди, Мы всегда об этом верили и знали. Ну что, глупые люди не могли бы поднять экономику на такой уровень, которого не достигли. Но мы тоже, знаете, не мух, так сказать, ноздрями бьем. А за 42 года, знаете, так шагнули. Значит, да, что достойные партнеры. Что?
You must not be afraid of ideas.
Вот мы вам говорим, вы-то не бойтесь идей, а нам бояться нечего. Мы уже вырвались из этого, понимаете, положения, когда нас идеи не пугают.
Yes. Well, then let's have more exchange of them. We all agree on that, right?
Хорошо. Вот. Что, с чем согласны?
Now let's go look at our picture.
Я согласен. Я хочу уточнить, с чем я согласен. Я имею право. Я же знаю, что я дело имею с хорошим адвокатом. Поэтому я хочу свою шахтерскую массу, так сказать, тоже, так сказать, чтобы поддержать на высоте. Чтобы шахтеры сказали, вот наш не уступает адвокату.
No question about that.
Вы адвокат капитализма, я адвокат коммунизма. Вот давайте мы посоревнуемся.
All that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself. But what I mean is this. Here you can see the type of tape which will transmit this very conversation immediately. And this indicates the possibilities of increasing communication. And this increase in communication will teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything.
Если я не все знаю, так вы о коммунизме совсем ничего не знаете. Кроме страха у вас ничего нет.
If I don't know anything, then communism doesn't know anything except fear.
I don't think you translate.
If I don't know something, well, then you don't know anything about communism except fear.
Потом, сейчас мы диспут ведем не на равных основах. Аппарат ваш, вы говорите по-английски, я говорю по-русски. Ваши английские слова записаны и будут показаны, и услышат. А то, что я говорю, вам на ухо только переводит. И поэтому американский народ этого не будет слышать. Это неравные условия.
There isn't a day that goes by in the United States when we can't read everything that you say in the Soviet Union. And I can assure you that never make a statement here that you don't think we read in the United States.
Так вот, возьмите тогда, если так, я вас ловлю на... Поэтому я хочу, чтобы вы, вице-президент, что вы даете слово, что моя речь тоже будет записана на английском языке. Будет, нет?
Certainly it will. Certainly. Yes. Right. In fact, and by the same token, everything that I say will be recorded and translated and will be carried all over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
Все будет на русском языке. Мы деловые люди. Сразу сошлись на этом.
He also was heavily in favor of the American involvement in the Vietnam War from the very beginning. On August 8, 1968, on the last day of the Republican National Convention in Miami, Nixon was nominated on the very first ballot with 692 votes to 277 votes for Nelson Rockefeller and 182 votes for California Governor Ronald Reagan. Following his nomination for president, he ran on phrases like the silent majority and peace with honor in relation to the Vietnam War. America was a very divided place at this time, which made these terms resonate with half the country, while the other half questioned Nixon. This was best illustrated on Election Day 1968, when Nixon won 43.4% of the vote, while U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey won just 1 percentage point less. The game changer in the election was Governor George Wallace, who once said in 1963, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." He ran as a third-party candidate, yet he received about 13.5% of the vote. Following the election, Richard Nixon and his vice president, Spiro Agnew, introduced what is known today as the Nixon Doctrine. While existing military commitments would be kept going, potential new commitments would be hesitantly approached. Rather than becoming directly involved in conflicts, the United States would provide military and economic aid to nations that were subject to insurgency or aggression. Before he took office, he often made statements to suggest he had a secret plan on how to end the war in Vietnam. At the time, there were around 500,000 American troops in Southeast Asia, and the American people were not happy about it. For the first time in our history, veterans of an active war protested against that very same war. Most notably, on April 26, 1971, a large group of these vets threw their war medals over the White House fence. About 1 year before he took office, the Apollo program was created, as was the Soyuz program. Sadly, both programs began in disaster. On January 27, 1967, the first crew of an Apollo mission, Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger Chaffee, were killed in a fire that engulfed their spacecraft cabin during a ground test less than a month before the planned February 21st launch. It was later found by a board in charge of investigating that there were design and construction flaws in the spacecraft and procedural failures, including the use of pure oxygen on the test, as well as inadequate safety procedures. Interestingly enough, as noted before, the hatch of the spacecraft was in fact changed early on from an explosive hatch to a hatch that had to be manually opened. This was because during the splashdown of Gus Grissom's Liberty Bell 7, the hatch suddenly exploded, which caused water to flood in. He nearly drowned, but was rescued quickly by helicopters. If this hadn't happened, the same hatch would have likely been used on the Apollo 1 spacecraft, and maybe all 3 astronauts could have lived. In a sense, it was an innovation and an effort to save lives that ended up taking lives. History has a way of being very confusing and exceedingly frustrating sometimes.
3 months after this disaster, on April 24, 1967, one of the darkest Soviet incidents of the space race occurred. Very few know about the events of the Soyuz 1 today, partially because of Soviet censorship. The spacecraft had a single pilot, Vladimir Komarov, and even he knew the capsule was constructed poorly. In 1967, both Yuri Gagarin and Komarov were assigned to the same mission. Gagarin was the backup pilot, and both knew the space capsule was not safe to fly. Komarov told his friends and family that he knew he would likely die. However, he went ahead with the mission because he didn't want Gagarin to die, as Gagarin would have been his replacement. The plan of the mission was to launch a capsule, the Soyuz 1, with Komarov inside. The next day, a second spacecraft would take off with 2 additional cosmonauts. The 2 vehicles would meet, dock, and Komarov would go from one capsule to the other, exchanging places with a fellow cosmonaut. He was then scheduled to come home on the second ship. The Soviet government wanted this to happen specifically on the 50th anniversary of the Russian Communist Revolution. Unbelievably, Gagarin and some senior technicians inspected the Soyuz 1 and found 203 structural problems prior to launch. Apparently, Gagarin wrote a 10-page memo out of concern and gave it to his best friend in the KGB, Benjamin Rusayev. But no one ever sent it up the chain of command. Today, it is believed that everyone who saw the memo was demoted, fired, or sent to diplomatic Siberia. Komarov clearly knew he was going to die, which makes the story all the more heartbreaking. As one does more and more research about Soyuz 1, nothing can surprise them anymore. On launch day, April 23rd, 1967, a Russian journalist, Yaroslav Golovanov, reported that Gagarin showed up at the launch site and demanded to be put into the spacesuit, though no one was expecting him to lift off. The man was trying to save his best friend's life. Despite this, Komarov still launched that day. Once he began to orbit the Earth, the issues began. Antennas wouldn't open properly. The power in the spacecraft was very inconsistent. It became very difficult for him to navigate, and the following day's launch had to be cancelled. Now, get this. The United States was likely listening to the Soviets' ground control communications. They apparently heard many things, such as the overhearing of Komarov telling ground control officials he knew he was about to die, or Komarov's wife being heard on a call to ask her husband what to say to their children. It is believed that when the capsule began its re-entry and the parachutes failed to open, American intelligence picked up Komarov's cries of rage and terror. The word "killed" was used by Komarov in his last moments. Some of the Soviet officials in ground control reportedly were crying. Komarov and his capsule burned up in the atmosphere on re-entry. This graphic photo illustrates the horrors of Soyuz 1. Later on in both space programs, these issues were fixed. The first 3 Apollo missions were unmanned following the Apollo 1 fire, and the first 2 Soyuz missions were unmanned after Komarov's death. All were successful.
Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo mission, launched on October 11, 1968, from Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. The main point of the mission was to test the new equipment and to see if humans could survive with said equipment for around 10 days. The mission was a success. However, the Soviets did not have a fully successful manned mission until January of 1969. The same year, the Americans landed on the moon, which can tell you at this point, the Americans had a huge jump start to the moon. The Soviets' first manned mission to fully succeed was the docking of Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5. For the Americans, it was now time to not only test some new technology, but to go to the moon. On December 21st, 1968, Apollo 8, with Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot Jim Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot William Anders, launched in a Saturn V rocket, the first such mission to do so. Their mission was to orbit the moon, which had never been done. Indeed, this would be a mission of firsts. They also became the first to leave low Earth orbit and go to another celestial body, entering lunar orbit on December 24th. Pilot Jim Lovell made 10 orbits in 20 hours, and the crew transmitted one of the most watched TV broadcasts in history, with their Christmas Eve program from lunar orbit, which concluded with a reading from the biblical book of Genesis. Some of the photographs they took during lunar orbit have become iconic today. When American politicians traveled the world on diplomatic missions, they often brought these photos, specifically this photo, known as Earthrise. It was the first time that we saw ourselves. Try to imagine yourself all alone in the vacuum of space. The prospect is scary. It is even difficult to comprehend what such an experience is like. But for these astronauts and cosmonauts, this was their job. The next 2 Apollo flights would test new technology, including the lunar module, the device that would be used to land on the moon. These missions also made an effort to get as close to the moon as they could without landing. In January of 1969, the Apollo 11 crew was chosen. It consisted of Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin. On July 16, 1969, at exactly 9:32 a.m., on a Saturn V rocket, they lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in South Florida. Over 1 million people watched the launch of Apollo 11 in person, including half of Congress. They intended to go to the moon. Both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were to use the lunar module to land on the moon, while pilot Michael Collins was to fly the command module Columbia alone in lunar orbit while his crewmates were on the moon's surface. Just like their prior 3 missions to the moon, the trip would take just over 3 days. On July 19th at around 5:30 p.m., Apollo 11 arrived at the moon and began to enter lunar orbit. In the 30 orbits that followed, the crew saw passing views of their landing site in the southern Sea of Tranquility. The site was selected partially because it had been characterized as flat and smooth by the lunar rovers already there. During the landing process, several alarms went off, which are today believed to have been caused by so-called overflows. Either way, the landing went ahead, and around 3 hours after getting to the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin landed, and millions of people around the world heard the same 8 words.
Lights on, forward, 40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust, nice shadow, forward, drift to the right a little, 30 seconds, forward, contact light, okay, engine stop, we copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed.
Many don't know this next fact, but the original plan was not to get out of the lunar module immediately and walk on the moon. The schedule for the mission called for the astronauts to follow the landing with a 5-hour nap, but they chose to begin preparations for the moonwalk early, likely because they would be unable to sleep, possibly because they were so excited to get to work. 2.5 hours after landing, Buzz Aldrin said,
Roger, this is the LEM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever, wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his or her own way. Over.
Interestingly, Aldrin then took communion privately. It was during this period in 1969 that NASA was still enveloped in a lawsuit brought by atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who had objected to the Apollo 8 crew reading from the book of Genesis, as shown earlier. She demanded that future astronauts abstain from broadcasting religious activities while in space. Because of this, Aldrin chose to not directly mention his taking communion on the moon. Early in the training of Apollo 11, it was decided that Neil Armstrong would walk on the moon first, and then Buzz Aldrin second. 6 hours and 39 minutes after landing, Armstrong and Aldrin were ready to get going after hours and hours of preparations. Special cameras were attached early on to the lunar module in order for people to watch the moonwalk live. And here it is, a moment in history.
There's that foot coming down.
There he is. There's a foot coming down the steps.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. It's a pretty good little jump.
So there's a foot on the moon, stepping down on the moon. If he's testing that first step, he must be stepping down on the moon at this point. 10.
Buzz, this is Houston. F2, I'm at the 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera. Okay. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only a few depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Boy, look at those pictures. Wow. It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think that was Neil's quote. I didn't understand it.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase.
Neil Armstrong intended to say, that's one small step for a man. But the word "a" is not audible in the transmission, and therefore was not reported at first by most following the live broadcast. When later asked about his famous line, Armstrong said he believed he said "for a man." Clearly, this was a planned quote. His first step was witnessed on live television by at least 1/5 of the population of the Earth, or about 723 million people. Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface of the moon about 20 minutes later. Together, they spent just over 2 hours outside the lunar module. The next day, they conducted the first ever launch from another celestial body, and met back up with Michael Collins in the Columbia spacecraft. Before they went back home, they left this plaque, which says, "Here, men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." The Americans had now walked on the moon, and they weren't finished. On the very next mission, 3 months after Apollo 11, Apollo 12 launched on November 14, 1969 from the Kennedy Space Center. Most notably, shortly after being launched, Apollo 12 was twice struck by lightning, causing a few minor instrumentation problems. The Saturn V rocket was designed to withstand this type of weather, so very little damage occurred. Commander Pete Conrad and lunar module pilot Alan Bean stayed on the moon for just over 1 day, while command module pilot Richard Gordon remained in lunar orbit. Interestingly, Apollo 12 was the first mission which used a color television camera on the lunar surface. But transmission was lost after pilot Bean accidentally pointed the camera at the sun, which destroyed the camera's sensor. Aside from the lightning strikes and camera malfunctions, this mission, one could argue, actually went better than Apollo 11. 5 months later, Apollo 13 launched on April 11th, 1970, and headed to the moon, which at the time didn't seem like a big deal. The moon had already been walked on, and many started to ignore the American space program, especially the media. However, this mission would be unlike any other in American history. For starters, the crew was made up of Commander Jim Lovell, Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert Jr., and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Hayes Jr. For the first time in an Apollo moon landing mission, a backup crew member had to be used. Swigert was originally the Command Module Pilot of Apollo 13's backup crew, with John Young as commander and Charles Duke as Lunar Module Pilot. 7 days before the launch, Duke contracted rubella from a friend of his son. This exposed both the main and backup crews, who always trained together. Of the 5, only the original Command Module Pilot, Ken Mattingly, was not immune through prior exposure. Normally, if any member of the prime crew had to be grounded, the remaining crew would be replaced as well, and the backup crew substituted. But Duke's illness ruled this out. So 2 days before launch, Mattingly was replaced by Swigert. Mattingly never developed rubella, and later flew on Apollo 16. This was the first major hiccup of Apollo 13, and as the mission number suggests, conditions would worsen on the spacecraft. On April 14th, 1970, 3 days into the mission, Swigert conducted a routine stir of an oxygen tank, which caused a sudden explosion. In the minutes after the explosion, there were several unusual readings. One showing that oxygen tank 2 was empty, and tank 1's pressure slowly falling, that the computer on the spacecraft had reset, and the high-gain antenna was not working. Ground control initially was not aware of these serious issues. At one point, they suggested that there might be a false reading due to an instrumentation problem. Apparently, this was when Commander Jim Lovell looked out the window and reported a gas of some sort venting into space. This was believed to be the oxygen. There was a collective gasp in ground control. In order to preserve oxygen, nearly everything in the spacecraft was shut down, and the crew was told by ground control to move over to the lunar module, basically as a makeshift lifeboat. Because the spacecraft was shut down, the lunar module was freezing at approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit. In a sense, the module had to be used for something it was not meant for. Because of all these issues, Apollo 13's lunar landing was canceled, and mission controllers worked to bring the crew home alive. Often the phrase, "Houston, we have a problem," is associated with Apollo 13, but these words were not said. Rather, the words actually spoken, said by Jack Swigert, were, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." After being asked to repeat the transmission by the head of ground control, the Capcom Jack Luzma, Jim Lovell responded, "Houston, we've had a problem." While most of this documentary has been about the astronauts, it is often forgotten that around 500,000 people were involved in putting men on the moon. And when it comes to saving the lives of the Apollo 13 crew, this was no different. It was decided by Mission Control that the crew would go to the moon, orbit, and use the gravity of the moon to propel them on a course back to planet Earth. It should also be noted that the crew had to very carefully ration their limited water supply. The crew's ration was just under 7 ounces of water per person per day. The 3 astronauts lost 31 pounds combined, and lunar module pilot Fred Hayes developed a urinary tract infection. Today, it is believed that this infection was probably caused by the reduced water intake, but microgravity and effects of cosmic radiation might have also messed with his immune system's reaction to the infection. Prior to re-entry, the crew of Apollo 13 disconnected for the service module in order to splash down with just their capsule as customary. This shocking photo was taken by the crew shortly after. In terms of the splashdown, at first, there were concerns that the crew might come down in the Indian Ocean, which NASA was not prepared for, as normally splashdowns occur in the South Pacific. The capsule was shaky and very difficult to navigate, but Commander Jim Lovell did an amazing job at getting the spacecraft stable and ready for re-entry. The astronauts' dangerous situation shortly renewed public interest in the Apollo program, as an estimated 40 million Americans watched Apollo 13 splashdown, with another 30 million watching some portion of the 6-hour broadcast. Even more outside the U.S. watched the splashdown. On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 came back to Earth, splashing down over the Tonga Trench in the Pacific, one of the ocean's deepest points. Although very exhausted, the crew was in pretty good condition, except for Hayes, who, as noted before, was suffering from a serious urinary tract infection. The crew stayed overnight on the ship that picked them up, the USS Iwo Jima, and flew to Pago Pago, American Samoa, the next day. They then flew to Hawaii, where President Richard Nixon awarded them the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. They were received as heroes. The public reaction was quite extraordinary. Most notably, the United States Senate on April 14, 1970, passed a resolution asking businesses to pause at 9 p.m. local time that evening to allow for employee prayer for the Apollo 13 crew. Not only was this type of stuff seen in the U.S., but Pope Paul VI led a congregation of 10,000 people in praying for the astronauts' safe return, while 10 times that number came together to offer prayers at a religious festival in India. It's funny to think about, but America does not own space, and that is best illustrated by the heartwarming responses to the Apollo 13 crisis all over the world. Following these events, NASA set up a review board to investigate what happened, which included 11 members, including Neil Armstrong. It was later found that damaged Teflon insulation on the wires to the stirring fan inside Oxygen Tank 2 allowed the wires to short circuit and ignite, causing the explosion. Because of this investigation and the process of fixing potential decision flaws, Apollo 14 didn't take off until January 31st, 1971. This mission intended to accomplish a few firsts, including the first to land in the lunar highlands, which are elevated areas on the moon's surface. These are the lighter areas of the moon, visible to the naked eye, and are riddled with craters. It was almost the last of the H missions, which were moon landings at specific sites of scientific interest on the moon for 2-day stays with 2 lunar moonwalks by each astronaut. Commander Alan Shepard, the first American in space, Command Module Pilot Stuart Roosa, and Lunar Module Pilot Edgar Mitchell launched on their 9-day mission on Sunday, January 31st, 1971 at 4:03 p.m. While there were a few concerns about a possible abort early on in the mission, the expedition ended up going nearly flawlessly. Shepard and Mitchell made their lunar landing on February 5th in the Framaro Formation, which was the original target for Apollo 13. During their 2 walks on the surface, they collected nearly 100 pounds of moon rocks and conducted several scientific experiments. While Shepard and Mitchell were on the surface, Roosa remained in lunar orbit aboard the command and service module nicknamed Kitty Hawk and spent many hours photographing the moon, as was routine at this point in the lunar missions. This mission, while very unknown to the average listener, is likely one of the most fascinating missions one can read about today. For starters, Command Module Pilot Roosa took several hundred seeds on the mission, many of which bloomed on the return to Earth, resulting in so-called moon trees. Today, there are dozens of these fully grown trees everywhere from Montgomery, Alabama to Santa Rosa, Brazil. Also fascinating, Shepard conducted a so-called experiment he had been planning for years in case he reached the moon, and which is probably what Apollo 14 is best remembered for. Shepard brought along on the Saturn V rocket a Wilson 6-iron golf club head, which he had modified to attach to the handle of a sample tool, as well as 2 golf balls. Shepard took several one-handed swings due to the limited flexibility of his spacesuit, and then yelled that the second ball went miles and miles and miles.
Houston, while you're looking that up, you might recognize what I have in my hand as the handle for the contingency sample return. It just so happens to have a genuine 6-iron on the bottom of it. In my left hand, I have a little white pellet that so many of the millions of Americans drop it down. Unfortunately, the suit is so stiff I can't do this with 2 hands, but I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here. They got more dirt than ball this time. Got more dirt than ball. Here we go again. That looked like a slice to me, Al. There we go. Raise the die. One more. Miles and miles and miles.
Later, after liftoff from the lunar surface and a successful docking with Command Module Pilot Roosa, inside of the Kitty Hawk, the spacecraft was flown back to Earth, where the 3 astronauts splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on February 9th, 1970.
About 1 month before the launch of Apollo 15, disaster once again struck the Soviet space program. The original prime crew for this mission, Soyuz 11, consisted of Alexei Leonov, the first person ever to perform a spacewalk, Valery Kubasov, and Pyotr Kolodin. But an X-ray 4 days before launch suggested that Kubasov might have tuberculosis, and according to the mission rules, the prime crew was replaced with the backup crew. For cosmonauts Dobrovolsky and Patsayev, this was to be their first space mission. On June 6, 1971, Soyuz 11 launched and headed toward the unmanned Salyut 1. They arrived on June 7th, and the cosmonauts remained on board for 22 days, setting space endurance records that would hold until the American Skylab 2 mission in May and June 1973. While their stay in Salyut 1 started out successfully, including live Soviet television broadcasts, a fire broke out on day 11 of their stay, causing mission control to consider abandoning the space station. The crew also found that using the exercise treadmill, as they were required to do twice a day, caused the entire station to vibrate. On June 29th, the crew loaded scientific specimens, films, tapes, and other gear into Soyuz 11, then transferred manual control back from Salyut 1 to Soyuz 11 and returned to their capsule. Undocking was also successful. Soyuz 11 then flew co-orbit for quite a while. Radio communications abruptly ended at the moment when separation ended. The total flight duration of the crew was just over 570 hours and involved 383 total orbits. On that same day, June 29th, 1971, after an apparently normal re-entry of the capsule of the Soyuz 11 mission, the recovery team opened the capsule to find the crew dead. To this day, these three cosmonauts, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, are the only people to die in space. Following this tragedy, an official Soviet investigation found that the men died of pulmonary embolisms when the seal of the hatch, which was faulty, between their command module and their work compartment separated, compromising them to the vacuum of space. The three men were given a massive state funeral and buried in the Kremlin wall at the Soviet Red Square in Moscow. American astronaut Tom Stafford, in a symbolic gesture, was one of the pallbearers. They were also each posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, and Richard Nixon offered his condolences. Many at the time believed this was the ending of the Soviet space program. But instead, peace and honor would eventually prevail. About a month after the Soyuz 11 tragedy, on July 26, 1971, Commander David Scott, Command Module Pilot Alfred Worden, and Lunar Module Pilot James Irwin launched off to the moon. This was also a mission of firsts, as it was the first J mission, which basically meant there would be a longer stay on the moon and a bigger focus on science than prior missions. Apollo 15 was also the first mission to use the brand new lunar roving vehicle. The lunar surface portion of the mission took place between July 30th and August 2nd. David Scott and James Irwin landed near Hadley Rill and scouted the nearby area using the manned rover. This allowed the crew to travel longer distances and see more on the lunar surface than had been possible on previous missions. They spent nearly 20 hours on the moon's surface. While this mission is not very well known today, there is one moment of this mission that is absolutely fascinating. During David Scott's moonwalk, he conducted, let's call it an experiment. This was conducted on live TV. He took a feather and a hammer to demonstrate Galileo's gravitational theory he had tested at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Scott knew that all objects in a given gravity field fall at the same rate, regardless of mass, in the absence of aerodynamic drag. He dropped the hammer and feather at the same time, and because of the weak lunar atmosphere, there was no drag on the feather, which hit the ground at the same time as the hammer.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Pretty cool, right? This was Joe Allen's idea, who happened to serve as the Capcom, or the head of mission control, on Apollo 15. He sort of wanted to compete with what Alan Shepard had done with the golf balls on the previous mission. Clearly, these men were just having lots of fun on the moon. And get this, the feather was from a female gerfalcon, which is a type of falcon that also happens to be the mascot of the United States Air Force Academy. Coincidence? Probably not. It should also be noted that Apollo 15 illustrated a moment of peace during the space race. This is an aluminum sculpture called Fallen Astronaut. It was created by Paul Van Hooydonk. It commemorated the astronauts and cosmonauts who had died for the advancement of space exploration. It was placed on the moon on August 1st, 1971.
Commander David Scott later noted that two names, Valentin Bondarenko and Grigory Nelyubov, were later found to be missing from the memorial because of the secrecy surrounding the Soviet space program.
During the return trip, Pilot Worden conducted the very first spacewalk in deep space. The Apollo 15 mission splashed down safely on August 7th, despite the loss of one of its 3 parachutes. About 2 months before the next moon landing, one of the most consequential diplomatic meetings in modern world history took place. Between February 21st to the 28th, 1972, President Richard Nixon visited the People's Republic of China. The 7-day official visit to 3 Chinese cities was the first time a U.S. president had visited China. Interestingly, Dick Nixon's arrival in Beijing ended 25 years of no communication of diplomacy between the two countries, and was a big step in normalizing relations. Fascinatingly, 2 presidents who both dealt with impeachment investigations, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, also were the 2 presidents who opened the door to China. They both seemed to have this idea that diplomacy and enhanced trade talks would make them more like us. But instead, one might argue our foreign policies in China have made them worse and more authoritarian. Today, it is believed that over 1 million Uyghur Muslims have been detained, while birth rates in many Uyghur regions have fallen by more than 60% due to forced sterilizations.
So I think we may come here even without the
바다가 날 10년 해.
I can only say that the Nebula like myself who have never seen it before, that it exceeds all expectations. When one stands there and sees the wall going to the peak of this mountain and realizes that it runs for hundreds of miles, as a matter of fact, thousands of miles over the mountains and through the valleys of this country, that it was built over 2,000 years ago, I think that you would have to conclude that this is a great wall and that it had to be built by a great people. Many lives, of course, were lost in building it because there was no machinery or equipment at the time. It had to all be done by hand. But under the circumstances, it is a certainly symbol of what China in the past has been and what China in the future can become. People that could build a wall like this certainly have a great past to be proud of, and people who have this kind of a past must also have a great future. My hope is that in the future, perhaps as a result of the beginning that we have made on this journey, that many, many Americans, particularly the young Americans who like to travel so much, will have an opportunity to come here as I have come here today with Mrs. Nixon and the others in our party. That they will be able to see this wall, that they will think back as I think back to the history of this great people, and that they will have an opportunity, as we have had an opportunity, to know the Chinese people and know them better. I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this, or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world. That peoples, regardless of their differences in backgrounds and their philosophies, will have an opportunity to communicate with each other, to know each other, and to share with each other those particular endeavors that will mean peaceful progress in the years ahead. So, all in all, I would say finally we've come a long way to be here today, 16,000 miles, and many things that have occurred in this trip have made me realize that it was worth coming. But I would say, as I look at the wall, it's worth coming 16,000 miles just to stand here and see the wall.
On April 16th, 1972, Commander John Young, Lunar Module Pilot Charles Duke, and Command Module Pilot Ken Mattingly launched on the second-to-last mission to the Moon. They had a few minor glitches, which ended up causing a 6-hour delay. This forced ground control to consider having the astronauts abort the mission and return to Earth. But before said decision could be made, the problem was resolved. Although ground control let the crew continue to the Moon, they were told to return from the mission one day earlier than planned. After flying the lunar module to the Moon's surface on April 21st, Young and Duke spent just under 3 days on the lunar surface, during which they conducted around 20 combined moonwalks. Together, they drove the lunar rover, the second used on the Moon, for nearly 17 miles. The landing and exploration were in the Descartes Highlands, a site chosen because some NASA scientists expected it to be an area formed by volcanic activity, but this was never proven. On the surface, Young and Duke collected Big Muley, the largest moon rock collected during the Apollo missions. During this time, Command Module Pilot Mattingly, who, as noted before, was left off Apollo 13 because of archaic exposure rules, orbited the Moon in the command module. As was routine, he took lots of photos. Mattingly, in the command module, spent 126 hours inside and did 64 revolutions in lunar orbit. After Young and Duke rejoined Mattingly in lunar orbit, the crew released a satellite from the service module. During the return trip to Earth, Mattingly performed a 1-hour spacewalk to retrieve several film cassettes from the exterior of the service module that had been used to take photos during lunar orbit, as every lunar mission had to do. Apollo 16 returned safely to Earth when it splashed down on April 27th, 1972 in the South Pacific.
Meanwhile, as always, the Soviets were in a pattern of successful missions, partial failures, and complete failures. Yet, today it is believed that they did not have another fatality during a mission during the space race. Clearly, their little mistakes created progress and better safety standards. On December 7th, 1972, Apollo 17 launched. This was the final moon landing mission of NASA's Apollo program, as Apollo 18 was canceled in September of 1970. To this day, it remains the most recent time humans have traveled beyond low Earth orbit, and also the most recent time humans have set foot on the Moon. Apollo 17 was crewed by Commander Eugene Cernan,
Lunar Module Pilot Harrison Schmitt, and Command Module Pilot Ronald Evans. This was also a mission of firsts, despite it being mostly known for being the last. Apollo 17 was the first mission to have no one on board who had been a test pilot. Most notably, X-15 test pilot Joe Engle lost the Lunar Module Pilot job to pilot Schmitt, who interestingly enough was primarily a geologist. The mission also included the first night launch of an American spacecraft. The mission also broke several manned spaceflight records, including the longest total lunar surface stay at just over 22 hours, the longest time spent in lunar orbit at over 6 days, and the most lunar orbits at 75. During their stay on the lunar surface, Cernan and Schmitt performed 3 moonwalks. While they stayed on the moon for several days, Command Module Pilot Ron Evans remained in orbit to take photographs and conduct experiments. Most notably on this mission, astronauts Cernan and Schmitt sang "I Was Strolling on the Moon One Day" to the words and tune of "While Strolling Through the Park One Day," which was a popular song in the 1930s and 40s, written in the 1880s. If you listen carefully, you can hear them correct themselves over the month listed in the song.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great?
Indeed, there is nothing funnier than walking on the frickin' moon. Before the crew lifted off for the very last time from the moon, they left this plaque, which says, "Here, man completed his first explorations of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace, in which we came, be reflected in the lives of all mankind." Many believe this to be the end of the space race. Many Americans, after the last Apollo missions were canceled, asked themselves, what's the point anymore? Why am I paying for this? Well, the way many historians see this today, the space race ended in peace, but not on the moon.
On July 15th, 1975, both a Soyuz U rocket and a Saturn IB rocket launched from opposite places of the world. Kazakhstan and South Florida, and headed toward each other as they planned to dock.
The Apollo crew was composed of Commander Thomas Stafford, who was a brigadier general in the United States Air Force at the time, and picked partially because of his relationship with the Soviets. Command Module Pilot Vance Brand, and Docking Module Pilot Deke Slayton, who had been a Mercury 7 astronaut.
Additionally, the Soyuz crew was made up of just 2 cosmonauts, Commander Alexei Leonov, who, as mentioned before, was the first person ever to conduct a spacewalk, and flight engineer Valery Kubasov. It took decades of peace talks, war prevention, and negotiations to make this mission happen. The Soyuz and Apollo flights launched within 7.5 hours of each other, and docked on July 17th, 1975. 3 hours later, the 2 mission commanders, Stafford and Leonov, exchanged the first international handshake in space through the open hatch of the Soyuz. Here is the moment in history.
Peace takes time. It cannot happen overnight. And the story of the space race shows us why patience in politics is so important. The Cold War did not end on that mid-July day. The world would see many wars and far too much carnage in the coming years. But as the space race illustrates, peace is possible. It can be done. But for one moment, on a small spacecraft, peace lived, and peace can thrive today with our efforts.